Imagine two of the most powerful nations on Earth, armed to the teeth. Warships loaded, cannons dialed in, soldiers just staring each other down through the crosshairs. One single order, literally one misstep, and you've got a massive globe-spanning war on your hands. In 1859, the United States and the British Empire were sitting on this absolute geopolitical powder keg. And you'd probably think the spark for this looming bloodbath was a political assassination, right? Or maybe a massive resource grab, but no. No, it wasn't. The spark was a pig. Just an ordinary, hungry, trespassing pig.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this has to be one of the most absurd, fascinating, and just terrifyingly close calls in all of military history. In this explainer, we're going to walk through exactly how a minor agricultural annoyance on a tiny island escalated so ridiculously fast that it nearly rewrote world history. We'll look at the rogue commanders who were just itching for a fight, the desperate diplomats who tried to pull them back, and the absolutely incredible true story of the Pig War. Section 1. A vague treaty's blind spot.
So to understand how a farm animal almost ended world peace, we actually have to rewind exactly 13 years before the first and, well, only shot was fired. The roots of this bizarre conflict actually started in 1846 with a piece of paper. Specifically, a really poorly worded diplomatic document drafted by guys sitting thousands of miles away in Washington and London who were looking at, frankly, wildly inaccurate maps. That document was the Oregon Treaty of 1846. Now, this was supposed to finally resolve the tense border disputes between the U.S. and British North America, basically what we call Canada today. The treaty drew a nice, neat, straight line right across the continent along the 49th parallel. But when that line hit the Pacific coast, things got incredibly murky. The treaty stated the border would continue to the middle of said channel and of Fuca Strait to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, sounds simple enough, right? Just draw a line right down the middle of the water. But there was a massive geographical blind spot.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact problem. You see, there wasn't just one channel out there. There were two main waterways winding through a cluster of islands. The U.S. looked at the map and said, well, obviously the border goes through the Harris Strait on the west. Great Britain looked at the exact same map and said, no, it clearly goes through the Rosario Strait on the east. So why the disagreement? Well, Britain wanted the Rosario Strait so they could control the entrance to Puget Sound, and the U.S. wanted the Harrow Strait for the exact same reason, and caught directly in the middle of these two straits was a chunk of land called San Juan Island.
Because of this vague wording, both empires claimed total sovereignty over San Juan Island. It wasn't huge, but man, it was a crucial military vantage point that completely dominated the local straits. Basically, whoever held San Juan controlled the waters. So by 1853, the British Hudson's Bay Company, which was essentially a corporate arm of the British Empire at the time, moved in and set up the Bellevue Sheep Farm. But then, along came the late 1850s gold rushes. Disappointed American prospectors started drifting south and just started squatting on the island. So suddenly you have British corporate sheep farmers and rough, frontier-hardened American prospectors forced to be neighbors on an island where neither side agreed on whose laws actually applied. It was a literal 19th century geopolitical powder keg.
Section 2. Blood spilled over potatoes.
Which brings us to the inciting incident of our true crime-style narrative here. The match that lit the fuse of international conflict wasn't some grand military maneuver. It was a mundane farming annoyance that had just gone on way too long. The date is June 15th, 1859. This is exactly 13 years to the day after the signing of that ambiguous Oregon Treaty. Lyman Cutler, a Kentucky farmer who had claimed land on the island under U.S. law, wakes up to find a massive pig rooting through his carefully planted potato patch. Now, this wasn't the first time. This particular pig was a prized Berkshire boar belonging to Charles Griffin, the Irishman running the British sheep farm. Cutler, just totally fed up with his tubers being eaten and his, frankly, poorly constructed fences being breached, grabbed his double-barreled shotgun, took aim on disputed soil, and shot the pig dead.
Now, Cutler actually did feel a bit of remorse at first, so he walked over to the British camp to confess. And this led to an incredibly tense, darkly comedic exchange that has just echoed through history. Cutler allegedly tried to defend his actions, telling Griffin, hey, it was eating my potatoes, to which the furious Irish farmer, representing the might of the British Empire's corporate interests, supposedly snapped back, it is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig. I mean, it's the ultimate clash of stubborn character archetypes, right? You've got the rigid British loyalist and the defiant American squatter.
But the humor vanished pretty quickly when they got to the money. Cutler offered $10 in compensation, which is about $360 today. Griffin, absolutely insulted, demanded $100, roughly $3,600 today. Cutler flat out refused to pay that outrageous sum for a trespassing animal.
So the British authorities on the island, who are already fed up with American squatters, threatened to arrest Cutler and bring him to Victoria for trial under British law. Terrified at the prospect of a foreign military arresting an American citizen on what they firmly believed was U.S. soil, the local settlers drafted a desperate petition begging the U.S. military for protection.
Section 3. Standoff at San Juan.
This is where the story shifts from a localized property dispute into a terrifyingly rapid military escalation. Communications from the island reached local, rogue military commanders in the region way before they ever reached the actual politicians back in Washington or London. And those local commanders on both sides, they decided to go totally rogue. Just look at how breathtakingly fast this timeline moves. The pig is shot in mid-June. By July 27th, U.S. troops have boots on the ground on San Juan Island. By August 10th, barely 2 months after a guy got mad about his potatoes, you have a massive, heavily armed naval standoff. How does it escalate that quickly? Well, it all comes down to the aggressive posturing of the men calling the shots.
It actually started with a deployment of just 66 men. The staunchly anti-British U.S. General William Harney got the settlers' plea and saw a perfect chance to aggressively assert American dominance. So he sent a small 64-man infantry unit, plus a couple of officers, under the command of Captain George Pickett. And yes, that is the exact same George Pickett who, just a few years later, would lead the infamous Pickett's Charge for the Confederacy at Gettysburg. So Pickett lands his men and immediately declares the whole island American territory, basically saying they were ready to shoot anyone who tried to land.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how fast that tiny force grew. When the British didn't immediately back down, the Americans doubled down. Within weeks, that initial landing party ballooned to 461 entrenched American soldiers. And they didn't just bring rifles, okay? They literally dragged 14 heavy cannons up onto a high, windswept meadow, specifically chosen so they could rain artillery fire down on any ships passing through the strait. They were absolutely daring the British to make a move.
And the British, they were more than happy to oblige. The governor of British Columbia, James Douglas, was absolutely enraged by this American incursion. He responded with overwhelming, staggering force. He dispatched 5 heavily armed British Royal Navy warships carrying 70 cannons and a massive 2,140 men. These ships sailed right into the harbor, staring straight down the barrels of the American artillery. Douglas ordered his captains to land Royal Marines and clear the Americans off the island. The fuse was lit. Seriously, one nervous soldier pulling a trigger would start a global war right then and there. So the American Captain Pickett stubbornly refuses to yield, bluffing that his man would fight to the very last man. The British captains, realizing an amphibious assault on entrenched cannons would be an absolute bloodbath, decided to stall. They waited for the arrival of British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, who was the commander of the Royal Navy in the Pacific. When Admiral Baines finally showed up and surveyed the madness, thousands of men, dozens of warships, cannons all primed, he effectively became the only adult in the room. He flat-out defied Governor Douglas's orders to attack, uttering the now famous line, "I will not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig." Through sheer military professionalism, Admiral Baines single-handedly kept those cannons quiet.
Section 4. The Peacemakers Intervene.
Meanwhile, back across the continent and the ocean, in the capitals of Washington, D.C. and London, it took a full 6 weeks for news of this rogue military standoff to arrive. And when it finally did, officials in both governments were just paralyzed with shock. Neither nation wanted a war, especially the U.S., which was, rapidly sliding toward its own devastating civil war. So President James Buchanan immediately dispatches his top man, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, to the Pacific Northwest. Scott was a really sharp-minded negotiator who had successfully calmed border crises before. Arriving in October, he managed to talk Governor Douglas and the American commanders down off the ledge. They agreed to a massive de-escalation. Both sides would reduce their presence to a token force of no more than 100 men each. The Americans set up camp on the south end, the British on the north end, and a joint military occupation was officially established.
What followed was perhaps the most bizarre, friendly military standoff in all of history. While their politicians spent the next 12 years trying to figure out the paperwork and the legalities of the border, the soldiers on San Juan Island essentially just hung out. The rival camps had an incredibly amicable social life. British Marines would march down to the American camp to celebrate the 4th of July, and U.S. troops would head north to toast Queen Victoria's birthday. They held track and field events, horse races, picnics.
according to park rangers today, the biggest actual threat to peace on the island during this decade-long military occupation was the incredibly large amounts of alcohol both sides consumed together.
Section 5. The Kaiser settles it.
So while the troops were literally having potato sack races, the geopolitical gears were slowly turning. By 1871, the U.S. had emerged from the Civil War, and the two nations finally decided it was time to put the San Juan Island dispute to bed for good. But they knew they needed a neutral third party to make the call. Through the 1871 Treaty of Washington, both the United States and the United Kingdom agreed to submit the boundary dispute to international arbitration. And who did they choose to be the ultimate judge? The newly crowned, iron-fisted German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I. Both nations agreed that whatever the Kaiser decided, there would be absolutely no possibility of appeal. They presented their cases in Geneva, and the Kaiser handed the evidence over to a commission of 3 eminent German judges to ensure total impartiality.
So the crucial point is, after nearly a year of deliberation, the final verdict was delivered in October 1872. The German Commission ruled in favor of the United States. They agreed that the Haro Strait was the intended boundary, meaning San Juan Island was definitively American territory. And the British accepted the ruling with total grace. By November 1872, the British Royal Marines packed up their camp and peacefully withdrew. The American troops followed suit a couple of years later. A decades-long border dispute that brought 2 global empires to the absolute brink of war was finally over, settled without a single drop of human blood.
And the legacy of this bizarre event lives on in an incredibly unique way. Today, the area is actually maintained by the U.S. National Park Service, and every single day at the site of the historic English camp, American park rangers hoist the British Union Jack flag. It's one of the very few places in the world, outside of an actual embassy, where U.S. federal employees regularly raise a foreign nation's flag. It stands as a daily, physical testament to the lasting friendship forged from this absurd crisis, and a really cool tribute to the peaceful resolution of a highly dangerous standoff.
It's a funny story, sure, but it leaves you with a chilling thought to end on. If the stubborn pride of a squatter, a corporate farmer, and a few rogue military commanders over a single hungry pig could mobilize thousands of troops and dozens of warships in 1859, how easily could a minor misunderstanding, a crossed wire, or a localized dispute today spiral completely out of control? The pig war is a real testament to the fact that peace is incredibly fragile, and sometimes the only thing standing between diplomacy and total devastation is just one level-headed person in the room. Thanks for exploring this amazing